As you can see, today's presentation is Becoming a Space Pirate, our cybersecurity beyond Earth. So let's get started with a quick introduction on who I am and what this even is. My name is Morgan Thomas. I'm a cybersecurity engineer who somehow got involved in doing cybersecurity for satellites, which is kind of what this presentation is for. It's for the cybersecurity people who are curious, seeing all these new fields coming out and about, and just want to get their hands in the water and see what's out there and what we can grow in. So let's begin with a quick introduction into what is space. So if you're like me, you probably plugged into Google, what is space? And as a cybersecurity person, I did not understand anything it said. It was all very vague, as we can see here, and a lot of sciencey and calculus terms that I personally do not know. I'll read off one of the quick answers for you, which was, space is the boundless three-dimensional extent in which objects and events have relative position and direction. Now, if you're like me, that means absolutely nothing. So in terms of this presentation, we're going to be considering space as anything above the Earth's atmosphere. Cyber-wise, this means any electronical object that is in orbit outside of a gravity field. And this gravity field aspect is important. Today, we are not focusing on lunar rovers or Mars systems. We're going to be thinking satellites and space stations, specifically satellites today. So, what makes satellites interesting? A lot of us know vaguely what a satellite is. It floats up in space. We see it every once in a while with our own eyes or a telescope. But there's a really unique component to satellites that gets cybersecurity people interested. They have a ground station and they have a floating object that we call the space vehicle. These ground stations are networks that we, as cybersecurity professionals, are pretty intimately familiar with. They look like your regular networks. They have a server, they have desktops, there are hands-on keyboards. But the satellite aspect is a little bit different. There are computers, FPGA boards, and other things that we are pretty familiar with, but they exist differently than what we're used to. Satellites in particular have they orbit. There are different orbits, LEO, GEO, but what makes them really interesting and difficult to come to terms with cybersecurity-wise is that they only go over the Earth at certain points of time. So you can send directions up and down, but it's only when your ground station can see the satellite, which makes them a really unique thing to explore. And that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on today. So, as I said, there's a lot of curiosity, a lot of things to learn about intermeshing cybersecurity and space. So when you're approaching this concept, it's best to think like a pirate. Pull out that curiosity, pull out that desire to know things that you don't already understand, and really dig in there. In modern times, the best comparison to exploring this would be to look back at the wave of SCADA and IoT technology and what that did to the cybersecurity field. When SCADA really popped off, it was very difficult for cybersecurity professionals to understand how to secure these large systems. It used a bunch of technology that we were not all familiar with and a bunch of hardware that required specific knowledge sets for us to understand. IoT is kind of similar, but the difference is IoT scaled things down, where instead of focusing on traditional robust networks, IoT wanted to look at what happens when you make things small enough to be able to do what they need to do. And satellites are interesting because they pull in aspects of both of these. They need to be small and capable of doing what they need to do due to the limited bandwidth power, but they are also complex machinery that requires specific knowledge sets and cannot be turned on and off in the way that we're generally used to on the ground. So, like I said, satellites are similar. They require less resource-intensive frameworks, specific knowledge sets, and they come with their own unique sets of challenges. But they're also different because, for one, satellites are in space. You can't really see them except every once in a while when you know they're going specifically overhead, which means you can't touch, observe, or replace equipment in the same manner you would for your network on the ground. Resource limits are also a lot more different than what we're used to. Satellites can only handle so much bandwidth, power, and storage. So now that we've got the general aspect of what is space, what are we looking at, let's step back and go into our pirate theme. When you're approaching this new field, think like a pirate. When you're sailing the seas, you need to know the law. You need to know what laws you're breaking by going where, what laws you're abiding by, and you need to know the loopholes. Satellites are an interesting concept in terms of that. Space in particular has 5 international heritage laws. They're listed above, and most of them came around the 1960s and the 1970s when we sent the first man to the moon. The ones that really apply to satellites now would be number 4 and 5, the Liability Convention and the Registration Convention. And while all these are still in play, the geopolitical climate has changed so much in those years that there's a lot of leeway in how things are handled, specifically referencing the Liability Convention, which, when signed, stated that any space debris objects that landed in a country were the responsibility of the country launching them up to pay for reparations that may have damaged when it fell. This comes into play especially today when we're trying to tackle the space debris problem and how we're going to handle that as more things are sent up into space and more weapons are used, like anti-satellite technology, to explode them. So, moving past the heritage laws, we can look at the cybersecurity standards that are coming into play. I've listed 4 above. They range from 2012 to 2023. All of them are policies and standards that have been created by governmental authorities to influence the secure development and launch of satellites and space technologies. And I want to emphasize the word influence. These are not laws or regulations that companies are required to abide by before they launch their asset into space. Yes, a lot of companies have their own processes and internal security checkpoints that they need to go through before they provide a finished product, but there is no formalized guidelines or regulations that control the development, usage, or exploitation that are defined by U.S. Code of Law. So if that's a bit confusing, we can look at other domains for comparisons. We're all familiar with air, land, and sea, and the borders that define these 3 territories. You cannot cross over into another country without filling out proper paperwork or being aware of the laws that you're going into. This includes transport routes and on the ground and in the air, which when breaking, you are aware of the laws that are being enforced internationally and domestically. So in terms of air, land, and sea, the attack surface is generally static. You know what to expect when you're going into it, and you know the consequences should you do something wrong. Space, on the other hand, is basically borderless. It extends as far as the eye can see, and the best way to equate it would be endless international water. When you're thinking about space, you have to question who controls what. What are the consequences if you do something you are not allowed to? How do you know you're not allowed to do this thing? How are any of these laws enforced? Which means space is basically a very dynamic attack surface. It's always changing. There's always new players being introduced, new technologies, and we're always learning more. Space is just growing and growing. Now, I'm not sure if you can see it, but there is a middle part of this diagram that talks about where these 4 domains interact. And this is very important because all 4 of these domains interact in 2 areas that are essential for life as we know it, which is the military and government operations, as well as critical civilian infrastructure, which leads into our next topic, You need to know who's sailing with you. Who else has assets and liabilities up in space? You need to know the entire ecosystem that you're venturing into. By the end of 2022, there were an estimated 11,330 satellites in space. These were sent up by at least 92 countries who either controlled the satellites or had capabilities they controlled hosted on these satellites. There was no clear definition between the satellites that were active or inactive. So for all we know, there are 8,000 floating toasters up there doing nothing. And as of 2023, there are at least 124 United States organizations with satellite assets in space. We all know the big names: SpaceX, Elon Musk, Viasat, NASA, and they range from a plethora of different services, including imagery, research, GPS, telecommunications, and even some more interesting ideas, such as the manufacturers who look to do manufacturing things up in space. But beyond just those satellites, there's a whole nother field that really sets the tone for this ecosystem. Academia is the introductory part of all this research. Not every single college in the United States, but a good majority of them have a space program that is either dedicated to launching, providing, or creating research for the space market. They partner with big corporations such as Booz Allen Hamilton or NASA, and some of them have even got the funds to launch their own satellites independently, which is a pretty scary thought when you think of it. I'm sure a lot of us have interacted with college students, and we are well aware of how secure they think their stuff is. So if you can imagine interns with the control of small floating toasters and their unmonitored access ports and the iPhones that they're plugging into their servers, it does not paint a very pretty picture. And even if you dive a little bit deeper, you got to think about who controls the access inside of these labs. Is it just a college lab? How secure is it? Who monitors where the students go once they leave? Who monitors the professors? Who keeps track of this research that they're building out? Which is a pretty big deal when you think about how big the space equity investment has grown from 2013. Today, it's at $113 billion, and there's a whole range of suppliers from the very basic components to the launchers. And this is something, thankfully, that cybersecurity companies are already taking note of, which is why I'm here today. These big companies are building increasing cybersecurity resources, and even startups are starting to enter the field. A name a lot of you guys are probably familiar with is Spider Oak, and they've made a big boom in the enterprise by recently being hosted on the International Space Station. And they provide file site encryption for space vehicles to secure their communications from the ground station and up. So now that we've got all our friendly companions who are floating in the seas with us, let's get to the interesting part. Know your waters and know the dangers within them. So, like mentioned, the attack surface for satellites is a little bit different. There's a ground station component, something we're all familiar with, and we are pretty adept at getting into the network structure there. But when we transition from the ground station to the satellite, things get a little more confusing. We could go hours and hours on talking about the specific components hosted within the satellite that can be vulnerable to attack, but today we're just going to focus on 4 vague things, which is the flight compute, the payload, the encryption, and the signals. These are all 4 integral parts of the tasking for satellites, and should any of them be attacked or affected, you have the possibility of rendering the satellite void. Some of the aspects that you can attack are included above, which are tasking, power and control, receiver, transceiver, broadcast, and communications. Without any of these things, the satellite basically becomes a giant hunk of floating metal. And even deeper inside, once we take a step into the internal components of the satellite, some of these things are going to become more familiar. Satellites have real-time operating systems such as VxWorks, OpenRTOS, and Linux, something we're all very familiar with here. And they also have flight software that is what controls and makes sure the satellite is doing what it needs to do. You can see the NASA's core flight service as an example here. Today, if you go down to the SDL Space Community Village in the exhibit hall. There's also payload applications such as Arduino, Linux, and software-defined radios. But what is the big kicker of this is that everything that we see hardware-wise is having to be translated into software to fit the power and resource limitations presented inside satellites, which means things that we generally might not be familiar with, like programming FPGA boards, are now turning into Linux applications and things that we are very familiar with and know coding-wise and exploitation-wise, which we can see from above. Here are some known attack groups that have looked to get into the aerospace sector. The interesting thing you'll see here is most of these attack groups are Chinese espionage groups. They have gone after aerospace, defense, and government sectors from the United States, Asian countries, Russia, and the UK. Some of them include Axion, Trip, MenuPass. These are familiar names that pop up every once in a while in the news. Some more interesting ones are included, which include space pirates. I could not leave that out considering the name of the presentation. But they are a suspected Chinese espionage group that has gone after Russian and Serbian and Georgian aerospace and defense corporations through introducing malware and backdoors. Another interesting one is Turla. They are a Russian APT group, and unlike the other groups mentioned, they do not specifically target aerospace defense groups, but they utilize the vulnerabilities inherent within satellite communications to exploit their own attacks. They were able to abuse satellite communications to hijack internet downstream links and spoof the IP addresses in order to erase the existence of the execution of their attack. Speaking of attacks, here are a few that have popped up in recent times. You have NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory hack, which was an unnamed APT group that successfully managed to infiltrate the IT center of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory through an unauthorized Raspberry Pi. You also have the European Space Association hack by Anonymous, who was able to infiltrate and dump 8,000 users' data through a SQL flaw. And then you have Acid Rain, which popped up very recently during the Ukraine and the Russian war. And it was the wiping malware that was used against Viasat in the original push through from Russia. But what I want everybody to take a look at here is that these three attacks, they are focused on the ground station. As of now, there is no malicious documented attack that was able to execute code on a satellite without introduction through the ground station. And as I say that, somebody will probably mention Moonlighter, which popped up in 2023's Hackasat and was a live satellite that was used for the Hackasat competition this year, where the teams were able to execute code on the actual satellite. For those of you that are not aware, Hackasat is a CFT-style competition hosted by the Department of Defense every year for the last 4 years. It starts with preliminaries every summer, and 8 teams who successfully complete the challenges move on to the final rounds, where they fight for prizes ranging from $20,000 to $500,000. Not $500, $50,000. I wish it was $500. So if this is something that you're interested in pursuing and you really want to tackle the hacking side of cybersecurity for space, this is a great competition to enter. At least hundreds of teams enter every year. They're internationally, and they can be pretty much as big as you want them to be. So now that we know the attackers, we're coming to the end of the story, and we need to know our map and where we go from here. If this is something you're interested in, there's already several resources out there for categorizing and understanding the threats and the vulnerabilities inherent within the space vehicle systems. You have SPARTA, which is released by the Aerospace Corporation, and it's the Space Attack Research and Tactic Analysis. It resembles MITRE ATT&CK very closely in that it models attacks and remediations against space vehicles. You also have the TREX framework, which is the targeting, reconnaissance, and exploitation kill chain for space vehicles. It's a mind map that goes through the rationale and the reasoning why somebody would target a space vehicle and the mission and the exploitations they might pursue in order to knock that vehicle out. Now, if that's still not enough, there's several resources out there, but you have to dig a little bit to find them. Most resources that come up when you type in cybersecurity for space are that we need to focus on it and we need to build it up. So if you want a few areas that you can look into further, there's several education opportunities, such as Capital University, Embry-Riddle, and Johns Hopkins. There's even a certificate that I personally do not know if I would recommend everybody, but it's something to look into. I have no personal experience with it, so I do not take this as a promotion. And there are also resources. The Space ISAC is the information sharing center, and they host a conference for every year and provide analysis and information sharing for entities and individuals interested in space and the intelligence threats. Aerospace Organization is also a very good resource, as they're the ones who created the SPARTA model, and they do several publications a year that dive deeper into the threats regarding space. And then finally, you have the Hackasat library, where every Hackasat technical paper is posted, where you can go through and review all the code executions and the ways and the vulnerabilities that the teams were able to exploit in order to capture the flag or sabotage the satellite for their year. So with that, I guess we now say if you're ready to set sail and look further into this and see if you're up to exploring the challenges and the curiosities that come with entering the space for cybersecurity career field. So, questions?